This video will be part one of my coverage of Erikson's work in PSY 230 personality theory. You're probably most familiar with Erikson as a developmental theorist. His theory of lifespan development is something that students in introductory psychology classes struggle to learn all the pairings of the different developmental stages, trust versus mistrust, and so on. We're going to take a little bit bigger picture look at Erikson's work, where his work came from, and from his early history studying many of the same roots that we've already looked at in previous theorists, including being influenced by Freud's work and other psychoanalysts. So we'll start with his origins. He was born in the early 1900s. He was born into a Jewish family. Later, as an adult, he married a woman who was Christian and then converted to Christianity. He started out studying art, and he spent some time teaching school and teaching art to children in families who were traveling to Vienna specifically to see some of the psychoanalysts who were in that community of psychoanalysts in Vienna. He actually did analysis himself with Anna Freud, who is Sigmund Freud's daughter. So he got his early kind of introduction to the world of psychology through those originators of psychoanalytic theory, primarily the first generation after Freud. He then, as a result of practicing analysis, he became a full member of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in the 30s. He, like a lot of his contemporaries, people who had Jewish heritage, it was not possible to remain in Europe at that time period during World War II. So he emigrated to the United States. He worked at Harvard Medical, at Mass General Hospital. He also worked in private practice, and primarily he was working in the capacity as a psychoanalyst. Despite that, he was very well rounded. He had many different intellectual interests. He was in a position in the mid-1930s at Yale Medical School where his interest in anthropology and kind of the intersection between anthropology and health and psychology all kind of mixed together. And he started using some anthropological methods in his research looking at the Native American experience. Now, critics of that research from a modern perspective argue that the work was not particularly forward-thinking. Some argue that it was, by modern standards, quite racist in its outcomes. So you have to kind of put his work in that area within its proper historical perspective. Later, he took a position at UC Berkeley, where his interest in lifespan development really kind of solidified. Some of the anthropological work that he had done got him to thinking about, the life cycle and how people continue to grow and continue to change across the course of the lifespan. Simultaneously, and this isn't well known, certainly it's not often publicized, but he did a lot of his thinking in concert with his spouse. So even though he did a lot of this writing, like Childhood and Society, which was published in 1950 and remains in print, he did a great deal of his work, his collaborative work, with his wife Joan Erikson. And while she's not always seen as a partner in his intellectual work, especially his work between 1950 and the period of time when he was at Harvard, they collaborated extensively in his writing about development, and many of her contributions are sort of hidden. what are Erik Erikson's major contributions? As your authors describe, first and foremost, Erikson is credited for kind of softening and broadening Freud's original view of development. So you have Freud's psychosexual stages really kind of are heavily detailed in the early years. So you have infancy, early childhood, later childhood, and adolescence. And then there's not a lot of nuance or distinctions drawn anything beyond that late adolescence period. Erikson felt that was inaccurate. It missed a lot of developmental process, a lot of changes that people go through across the lifespan. He also felt that Freud's overemphasis on sexuality missed a whole lot of other factors, other elements of human experience that were equally important, particularly the role of relationships in people's developmental course. So he transformed the psychosexual stages into a lifespan model of ego development. When we get to the point in this discussion of talking about the specific stages of development, you'll see some of the ways in which he transforms the original Freudian stages into a more social, more ego development-oriented form. This contribution, as I mentioned already, he broadened the Freudian approach in addition to de-emphasizing sexuality and making greater the emphasis on social and interpersonal relationships in other contexts. He also argued that we never stop developing, that our sense of self, the challenges that we face, they change across the lifespan, and they continue to do so. He also argued that each stage of development can either have positive or negative valence. This is like he's altering in some ways the original Freudian approach, was just to say, in childhood, you can either have parents who overindulge you or underindulge you. And either of those is going to have negative results. Health happens when you have parents who are able to balance those two polar opposites. For Erikson, he agreed with Freud basically that yes, you can have parents who are either too restrictive or too permissive. However, he also added this nuance that you can have at each developmental stage, you can move either in the direction of positive resolution of the challenges at that stage, or you can move in the direction of negative resolutions of the challenges in that stage. And we'll talk more about what that assumption means in the big picture as we move through his specific stages of development. Now, one concept that you need to understand to kind of get your head around Erikson's thinking is this idea of epigenetics, which is, it's a word that, it has a meaning that among like biologists, embryologists, has one kind of use. In popular culture, the word epigenetic has taken on a whole different form, so we're not talking about that form. Erikson's model, essentially, he used this concept of epigenetic because he believed that the way human beings develop is in this sort of layering on top. So you have the original in infancy, and then you layer on top the next stage, and you layer on top the next stage, and you have this, kind of persistent process of unfolding, where each aspect of development is contingent on the previous aspect of development. So when you take the word apart, epigenesis means that the elements develop on top of other parts. So epi refers to upon, genesis to emergence. So the model, if you follow this the symbolism of embryonic growth is that each successive stage depends on the process of development that took place in the previous stage. What that means is, essentially, if you have flawed development in one stage, the flaws in that stage are going to be carried forward and make the next stage more challenging, and so on and so on and so on. If you have positive development at one stage, that positive quality is going to be carried forward to the next stage of development. Now, this issue of whether you have positive or negative development at any given stage, the way Erikson talked about that is in the form of crises. So he felt that each stage in psychological or ego development is characterized by a particular challenge, a particular social or psychological challenge. And he referred to these in terms of emotional crises or psychological crises. Now, you're familiar probably from your introductory psychology class trying to remember all of those pairs of trust versus mistrust and so on. Those paired words represent the core crisis for that particular stage in development. So development is seen from an Eriksonian perspective as a process that goes across life, but it's divided into discrete periods, discrete stages. And each stage is dependent on the stage that came before it. The amount of conflict that the person experiences in that stage could either be low or it could be high. If the conflict is relatively small, and some conflict is required or change doesn't occur, but if the conflict is manageable and presented to the person at whatever stage they're at in a way that they can manage, then they tend to move in a positive direction developmentally. If the conflict is overwhelming, if it's too strong, or the person doesn't have the kind of support that they need to manage the conflict, then the negative pole tends to be what's acquired. So each stage is characterized by a particular developmental crisis, and resolution of that crisis can result in the development of appropriate skills or strengths. So if people move in the positive direction, so if they face the conflict is manageable, and they have the support from others around them to assist them in managing that conflict, then they will come out on the other side of that crisis with new strengths, new skills. If, however, the conflict is very large and unmanageable, then they will have developed pathologies instead of strengths and skills. And as with the principle of epigenesis, you're going to carry your baggage with you. You're either going to carry strengths from a previous stage, strengths and skills, or you're going to carry with you pathologies. If you want to define what a crisis means in this context, they can be talked about as periods, crises that are characteristic of a particular period in the person's life. As this quote says, moments of decision where you can either go forward or you can regress. So for just a little bit of fun, I was on YouTube a couple of years ago, just seeing what kind of Erikson stuff was out there, and I stumbled on this.
Well done. Ooh, all right, gentlemen. I hope you've learned a bad lesson in scaring today. Ooh. Nemo! No!
Dad?
You're about to swim in open water!
No, I wasn't.
It's just a good thing I was here. If I hadn't shown up, I don't know.
I wasn't gonna go. Yeah, you was too afraid. No, I wasn't.
This does not concern you, kids. And you're lucky I don't tell your parents you were out there. You know you can't swim well.
I swim fine, Dad, okay?
No, it's not okay. You shouldn't be anywhere near here. Okay, I was right. You know what? We'll start school in a year or two.
No, Dad, just because you're scared of you.
Clearly you're not ready and you're not coming back until you are. You think you can do these things, but you just can't, Nemo.
But the really important ones are over here. I don't want to get too technical, but these are called core memories. Each one came from a super important time in Riley's life. Like when she first scored a goal. It was so amazing.
Without a master, they had no purpose. They became aimless and depressed. If this went on much longer, they would surely perish.
Now, Woody, he's been my pal for as long as I can remember. He's brave, like a cowboy should be, and kind and smart. But the thing that makes Woody special is he'll never give up on you. Ever. He'll be there for you, no matter what. You think you can take care of him for me? Okay then.
So basically, I show you that video because in some ways you can kind of anchor each of the scenes from those famous movies to a particular stage. Now we're going to start going through each of the stages. And the way each stage is laid out is you have a period of time, and that time period is framed by Erikson around a particular psychosocial crisis. It can either move in a positive direction or a negative direction. If it moves in a positive direction, you come out with strengths, or what Erikson called virtues. If it moves in a negative direction, what results is core pathologies. Now, this is similar in some ways to the Freudian model, where you have, and it's truncated because Freud only really dealt with development up to adolescence and a bit of late adolescence. But basically, Freud was like, you have your parents can either over or underindulge you. If they overindulge you, you move in one direction. They underindulge you, you move in another. If they're a nice balance, you are, down the middle. And your goal is to have limited defenses. Erikson transformed that a bit by talking, instead of about defense mechanisms as either relatively less problematic, he talked about the development of strengths or virtues. And then on the negative pole side, he did talk about the development of defenses, essentially, without necessarily calling them that. So the first psychosocial crisis is in infancy, and is characterized by trust versus mistrust. And what he suggested was that what infants are learning is, it's not that infants know nothing. They come prepackaged with a whole bunch of reflexes and abilities that are perfectly designed for being infants. Infants are pretty helpless, but they have the ability to communicate. They have the ability to focus on faces, to recognize certain emotions, and to communicate what they need. Not always very clearly, but they can. What their job psychosocially for Erikson is to learn to either rely on the continuity of care that they receive from the people caring for them, or they learn to distrust that. If they don't receive that kind of continuous care, if they are either neglected or they're cared for inconsistently, that can lead to mistrust. Another aspect of the trust versus mistrust psychosocial crisis is to think about your own ability to deal with impulses. So one of the challenges that infants have to learn is how to self-soothe. At the beginning of the infancy stage, infants, when they cry, they are uncomfortable. They usually require fairly straightforward things. They're cold, or they're too warm, they're hungry, their pants are dirty, and they cry rather immediately and vociferously until their needs are met. Over the course of infancy, however, babies start to learn how to delay having their needs met, to sleep on their own, and things like that. So over that period of infancy, learning to trust the reliability of your world is not just the fact that you get your needs met, but also learning to trust that they will be met even if they're not met right this second. The basic strength, if this conflict is dealt with minimal intensity, meaning that parents have been basically trustworthy and giving their kids what they need, then the child will develop a basic sense of hope, or the ability to believe that their wishes are going to be something that can happen. He argued that hope primarily came from the relationship with the mother. Now, forgive Erikson for being a creature of his time period. Women at that time, and for the most part still today, are expected to be the primary driver of care of infants. So he argued that this basic strength of hope comes primarily from the maternal connection between infant and mother. The mature form, so what we carry forward, remember, every stage you're going to carry with you, like a great big suitcase, either the strengths or the pathologies from your resolution of the crisis of that stage. So if you come through this infant stage with a basic sense of hope, as an adult, that hope can be transformed, in Erikson's opinion, to a general sense of faith. And he doesn't mean that necessarily in a religious context, more so in a general faith that the world is a positive place. Now, if the crisis is not managed effectively, if an infant doesn't learn that the world is trustworthy, that they learn perhaps that no one's really going to reliably take care of them, they may develop a defense that's essentially one of withdrawal. That you can't expect others to care for you, so why bother asking for help? So, he told the story of the infant who, despite being hungry or cold or wet, cries and cries and cries, and those cries are never responded to, or they're responded to with utter unpredictability. That baby may learn that crying makes no difference, and therefore they give up. So they learn how to self-soothe, but what they're acquiring is a tendency to say they must depend on themselves and no one else. Early childhood, and anyone who has been a parent of small children will tell you that it's really a lot about the potty. The psychosocial crisis of toddlerhood is, for Erikson, on one side, the development of autonomy, meaning, you can now get up on your feet and you can move around the world and make decisions about where you're going to go in that world. The alternative to autonomy is shame and self-doubt. He characterized, and again, this is, if you take the translation from the Freudian model, infancy is the oral stage, early childhood is the anal stage. So for Freud, he talked about the anal stage in terms of withholding and letting go. And he characterized either anal retentive or anal expulsive. So this stage, Erikson is kind of redefining that in the context of this psychosocial model. So what are toddlers doing? They're pushing and saying, I can do it, I can do it. They're also having to learn how to control their own basic bodily functions, including, using the toilet, being able to feed themselves, and so on. Another part of this stage is, as toddlers get up onto their feet, they start being able to move around their world. They will often, fall down, not be able to do the same things as, say, older siblings, or especially not the same things as great big adults can do with ease. It can be frustrating. There's a possibility, therefore, that one could become filled with shame or experience shame. Now, for parents, if the parenting that children in the toddler years are getting tells them, these are things you have to learn how to do, mistakes happen, like you can wet your pants, it can happen in public, it's not the end of the world, we're going to try and do better next time, then the child can face that crisis, that psychosocial crisis, with relative autonomy, learning how to hold, how to let go, how to, control those bodily functions, and a lot of pride can come from that. If parents are overly restrictive and punitive in their response, that can cause the child to internalize shame and become very doubting of themselves. Positive resolution of this conflict results in what Erikson referred to as will, or the ability to really shape your own intentions. We often describe, at least in American culture, toddlerhood as a battle of wills. And, I certainly had that experience when my kids were that age. Sometimes they would decide they were going to do something, even though they may or may not have the actual physical capacity to do it, but their stubbornness was just, determined that they were going to do whatever it was they said they were going to do. So, it's not surprising to me that Erikson would label this basic strength the will. Now, on the pathology side, if you're overwhelmed by this conflict, if you have parenting that is either completely permissive or overwhelmingly punitive, the pathology that can come from that, he believed, was compulsive. Now, that could come in either of the forms, very much like the Freudian version. Erikson felt that people could move in either direction of being slovenly and unkempt and uncontrolled, kind of willful, but in a disorganized way, or they can be overly self-controlling and limited. Regardless, what you have is feeling very constrained and kind of coerced. But the driver of that coercion is yourself. In early childhood, so this is referred to usually as the play age in the Eriksonian model. So for Freud, this was the point in his theoretical model where he's shifting to, the real emphasis on gender identity development and early expressions of sexuality. Erikson goes in a different direction. He's really more about what are kids learning in that early childhood period. They're learning about how to make plans, and they usually learn that kind of role-related behavior, rule-related behavior in an interactive play context. So when he talks about this idea of initiative, when children get together and they play, it's usually around an activity where, say, they have a pile of Legos, and little kids they will use language and they'll talk about what are we going to build. What that reflects is a sense of planning, of initiative, of creating a game. If you have little kids and they have a playhouse, they may decide, what game are we going to play in this playhouse? What roles are we going to play? So what kids are learning through their play is how to plan, how to create a story, how to act out a story. It's like their early practice at showing planning and direction and embracing and having a sense of purpose. That kind of fantasy play, he argues, is extraordinarily important. Now, notice that he's very clearly de-emphasizing the role of early expressions of sexuality, and in many ways is just sort of taking sex off the table, including taking gender identity development off the table as well, and focusing instead on what are kids learning through their play behavior. He argued that, kids as they play, they learn about their competencies. They also learn about their failures. They learn about social rules, and sometimes they learn that they're faced with kids who don't like them, some kids who do like them, some kids who are mean, some kids who are nice, some kids who are fun to play with, some kids who are not. So they're learning in these interactions about the emotional aspects of being in relationships with other people who are not your parents. The basic strength that comes from the play age, he argued, was what he called purpose. So when kids enter into play, whether they're playing by themselves or they're playing with other kids or they're playing with adults or older siblings, when they enter into play, they typically have a goal in mind. Whether they pull out a piece of paper and they get the crayons out, they have some sort of thing that they have in mind that they're going to do, even if it's just, I'm going to scribble on a piece of paper. Or if they are like, I would really like a cookie right now, I am going to go make a plan to find a way to, since the cookies are on a high shelf, I'm going to find a way to create a step so that I can get up high enough to get to the cookies. So purpose. You're giving focus and direction to a specific activity. The role of fantasy and play was significant for Erikson. He felt that kids at this age are just really in their own minds blossoming in this world of fantasy. In their play, when it is supported by others around them, like adults, older siblings, older relatives, whatever, caregivers, they can either thwart that play by labeling it as stupid or forcing the child to play above their age or forcing them into directed activities that the child doesn't choose. That can kind of stifle initiative and instead replace it with a sense of guilt. So think about times when kids are forced into activities that they don't really enjoy. What they may feel is guilty for not living up to what a caregiver or a parent or a sibling wants of them. But when they're left to choose their own activities, they can feel initiative within those activities. So when caregivers allow children some freedom to show initiative, to show things that they are interested in, and they support and validate those activities, then children can come away from that stage with a basic sense of purpose. The core pathology can be kind of guilt-driven inhibition, which you could also talk about as self-conscious or anxious self-thinking. Think again about that example. What if you have an early childhood age kid, and I think about all these kids, my kids played youth soccer. We weren't particularly serious about it, but there were some parents, you could tell, they really wanted, they were driven to have their kid be the next soccer star of the universe or whatever. And I mean, they were like 4 years old and they could barely, keep their pants up or let alone score a goal. But these parents were just determined. And when their kids would, get captivated by a dandelion on the soccer pitch, they would get angry with their kids for not paying attention to where the ball is or not playing their position. I mean, they're 4. How could they possibly know what their position is? But anyway, they're so intense about it, and what happens to their kids is they know that they've disappointed their parents. So if kids get too much of that, what they can come out of this play age with is that these activities are not fun. They don't give me a sense of initiative. What they leave me with is feeling guilty, like I've not lived up to the expectations of the people who matter to me. In the school age, so stage 4, now we're talking about kids who are, 5, 6 at the start of this stage. The crisis becomes now you're adding a new context. You're outside of your family environment, and you're adding the context of school where you have additional layers of tasks that need to be accomplished. You have additional people who are responsible for shaping you. You have teachers, you have peers, you have all kinds of people. So here, the focus, in Erikson's opinion, is industry, which means, productive work, versus feelings of inferiority. Now, Erikson was influenced in some ways by Adlerian thought. Adler talked a lot about the perception of one's own inferiority in contrast to the performance, the abilities of other people. Erikson really felt that kind of came into play in the form of the psychosocial crisis during the early school years for children. Here you still have a lot of play. There's a lot of play that goes on in the lives of kids once they start elementary school in the American context. However, there are expectations, and I certainly think there are probably too many. When you have kids as young as kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade having anxiety attacks over state testing, I think we're setting the bar a bit too high. But for Erikson, even, at his time period before we had high stakes testing of any sort, he still argued that was a period of time where you're really starting to have expectations that your kids perform meaningful work, and they do it well. Even outside of a school context, kids, when they hit that age, like in his studies, of other cultures, and even within the U.S. context of more agricultural families, kids as young as kindergarten age, and sometimes even earlier, are kind of woven into the work of, say, a farm life, doing tasks that are appropriate to their size and their physicality, but really they're woven into the productivity of that space. So it's not just school, but since he was operating from kind of a middle class to upper class reality, he is focused on the fact that these are kids who are going to go to school. The shift here into production of industry is also dependent on comparison. So like Adler, he argued that, you're comparing yourself to your peers and you're getting feedback from these important people like teachers. The emotions that can come from that when this crisis, industry versus inferiority, is handled with too much intensity. So if the demands are simply too high and the supports aren't strong enough, what kids can come through this stage with is a feeling that they're just not good enough, that they're inferior to others around them, and that they're not respected. That's both in the social sphere, but also in the academic. So the basic strength that you would come out of the school age with, if you have minimal conflict and good support, is a sense of competence. So where you have basic skills, you have general capacities, you can be productive and do work that's expected of you. And that applies also to like the home environment. Are you able to put your own clothes on? Can you brush your own teeth? Can you clean up after yourself after a meal? Things like that. So having that basic sense of competence and being able to engage in both practical and academic skills is like the earliest context in which kids are practicing the potential for adult-like behaviors. The core pathology, and it's an interesting choice of words here on Erikson's part, this idea of inertia, which when you look up what does inertia mean, the first definition that came up when I looked it up just out of curiosity was a tendency to do nothing. So if kids find this psychosocial conflict of industry versus inferiority too overwhelming for whatever reason, perhaps in kind of the Eriksonian vein, if you have a child, let's say, who is in school and attempting to learn to read, but they have dyslexia and they can't read, or they're slower at reading than their peers, they may have multiple experiences of failure and having their incompetence called out in a public space. Or let's say you have a child that is rejected by other children in that space, or you have a child who simply has a bad teacher, a teacher who mistreats children, who belittles them, who, isn't supportive in their challenges. That can leave kids with a sense of, I can't do it, therefore I'm going to do nothing. So it's not just doing nothing, but it can also be overt resistance to learning anything new as well. The fifth stage is adolescence, and for Erikson, he felt this was an absolutely critical period of time. And when we move into part 2 of this lecture, I'll deepen that conversation. But for now, the psychosocial crisis of adolescence, so puberty on to those sort of teenage years. In an American context, we're largely talking about middle school through high school. The crisis is characterized as identity versus identity confusion. Sometimes this is labeled as identity versus role confusion. Here, the challenge is to take what you've known about who you are, that includes your competencies, your sense of autonomy, your sense of your basic trust in the universe around you, and so on. How do you integrate that into some kind of meaningful whole? So what are your abilities? What are the things you enjoy? What are the things you hate? What do you want for yourself? What kind of skills do you have? What kind of skills do you want to learn? because this is that transition period. You're no longer a child, but you're not yet an adult. You have to figure out what it is that you want to be later. So, this is the period of time when you're moving from just the playful question that adults love to ask little kids, which is, what do you want to be when you grow up? Now it becomes more serious. Tween and teen, what are you planning on doing later when you're a grown-up? What are you going to do with yourself? So now kids are being asked to kind of take a psychological leap and say, what is your adulthood going to look like? Who are you going to be in that space? Hence the crisis. Now, your authors talk about this as integrating past identifications. Now, what that means is, who did you see yourself as a little kid? We have this human capacity to look backwards in time and to project forwards in time. What were you when you were little? Now, what are you as a teenager? What will you possibly be as an adult? And you're trying to figure all that out at a period of time when you're still in school, you're still young, you still have a lot to learn. That's the challenge. And you can see why Erikson would put so much stock in this particular stage. The strength, if people, again, the goal is to move through the stage, through the conflict represented by this stage, with as minimal conflict as possible, but enough conflict to push development forward. The basic strength, if you have good support and you're carrying from your earlier stages of development, the basic strengths of those stages, you can come through the stage of adolescence with what Erikson referred to as fidelity, which, if you look it up, are words like faithfulness, loyalty, support tend to be attached with this concept of fidelity. What he's referring to, at least my interpretation of it, is, are you a person that you can actually believe in? So the person you're presenting to the world, is it the same person you actually are? So is the person you're presenting a faithful representation of who you actually are? The person you put into the world, are you actually loyal to that person? Do you, in your own psychology, do you feel supportive of this person that you're putting out into the world? So when he uses this concept of fidelity, it's not so much faithfulness, loyalty, and support of another, although that can be part of it, but it's more about the match between the identity you're presenting outside and the identity that you feel inside. A lot of adolescence involve trying to put on different faces and present different selves to the world to find out what fits, what feels right, what feels good. And a lot of that takes place in the social context, building friendships, building dating relationships, changing the fundamental relationship you have with your parents, and so on. All of those experiences really are the building blocks of your value system, your moral judgment system, and ultimately your identity. If the negative pole is where the person developmentally is leaning, that means there's too much conflict, the person doesn't have good support, and they're carrying too much baggage from their earlier stages of development. What you come out of with is a basic pathology that Erikson called repudiation, which he referred to as self-rejection, or as Karen Horney would put it, alienation from the real self, so denial of true identity. For many of the second generation, third generation psychoanalysts post-Freud, they really latched onto this idea of the pathological nature of suppressing your true self. And Erikson was also on that bandwagon. His argument was that kids need the capacity to freely explore who they are and who they want to be. And if you try and force them into a mold that is what you want as their parent, you can force them to believe that the only way they can exist in your world is to present a false front And again, this idea of fidelity, if you are living up to the expectations of other people and not kind of living an authentic self that's consistent with how you actually feel, then you're not showing fidelity to your true self, to your true identity. So that concludes part 1 of my coverage of Erikson.